Alright students, it's time to learn about fisheries ecology. The cover picture that we have here is the North Atlantic cod fishery. So this is a trawler in the North Atlantic that has towed a big net and brought in this haul of cod. So as a warm-up here, I'd like you to pause on this slide and see if you can find the hidden history lesson in this comic. Alright, so if you've noticed some of the subtle differences between the 1959 era and today, the fish are smaller. That's due to overfishing, where we preferentially catch the largest fish and leaving only the smaller, less desirable fish. And another thing is that the man is larger, and it sort of is suggesting that we're over consuming or catching too many fish. Although the man probably didn't get that large from eating fish alone. Fish is a relatively healthy food. Probably he got big eating burgers and things like that, which brings up another important concept related to overfishing. So sharks also eat fish. Why don't sharks deplete the sea of fish the same way that humans do? I mean, there's certainly no regulations that are stopping sharks from eating all the fish that they want. Well, the reason is that shark and fish populations are linked. If the sharks eat too many fish, then there's not enough fish and the sharks die out and the populations are in balance. Whereas humans can fish and fish and fish, and the humans never die out just because the fish are depleted, because the humans have other sources of food, like agriculture on land, that's subsidizing our population. So we continue to deplete the fish populations in the ocean without seeing a big decline in our own populations, because we have other food sources. And of course that's really tragic for the big populations of fish that have been vastly depleted across the world's oceans. Alright, so fisheries actually doesn't refer to just fish. It's the harvest of living resources from the ocean, which can be any type of living thing. So it could be fish, could be whales, although most countries have stopped whaling, clams, crabs, algae, seaweed. Any living resource is harvestable from the sea. And living resources are not unlimited, but they are renewable. That means, because of the cycle of life which you're all familiar with, living things can repopulate after their populations are moderately depleted, and as long as you don't harvest at a rate that's faster than the population is able to replenish itself, then that harvest is sustainable and could be continued indefinitely. But it's very important that we not harvest at a faster rate than the populations can replenish themselves. Alright, so regulating our fisheries, regulating how much of these living resources that we harvest from the ocean, is a really difficult problem that scientists and politicians and even philosophers have struggled to come up with some guiding principles for our fisheries. But one of the important underlying principles of a sustainable ethos can be found in the works of Immanuel Kant, a German moral philosopher from the 18th century, I think, based on the hairdo. Kant said, "Only act according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." So that statement might be a little bit confusing, but a maxim is like a rule to live by. And so what Kant is saying is that you should act only according to rules to live by that you would wish everyone else lived by those same rules. And so if you're going to do something that you want for yourself, but you actually wouldn't want everyone else to be doing that thing, then you probably shouldn't be doing it yourself. So if you want to decide whether some action that you're debating is moral, consider it and think about how that action would directly and indirectly affect others' well-being in the present and the future. Kant valued everyone's well-being equally, and basically thought that a rational person would want to do things that were good for the well-being of as many people as possible. And so you think about, how would this action that I'm thinking about doing, like fishing a certain amount, how would that directly and indirectly affect others' well-being now and also in the future? Maybe it would be good in the short term but bad in the long term, and Kant wants you to consider the wider ramifications of what you're going to be doing. And so once you've considered the effects, then would a rational person wish that everyone took the action that you were thinking about doing? So if not, if you're not considering an action that a rational person would say, oh yeah, that's a good thing to do, then that action is immoral. So here's an example. You're out fishing, you've caught your limit, the amount that the scientists and the government said was the safe amount of that fish to catch without depleting the population. But the fish are still biting, the fishing is still good. So should you catch a few more? And so you have to pause and ask yourself, would a rational person wish that everyone, whenever the fish were biting, caught more than the limit? And you'd have to say, no, I wouldn't want everyone to just break the law when it suited them, because then pretty soon there would be no fish and I wouldn't be able to go fishing, and then nobody would be able to go fishing and we wouldn't have fish to eat. So that's how you would apply the Kant's categorical imperative. All right, so let's talk about the enterprise of fisheries. Fisheries means sort of the industry or business of harvesting living resources from the sea. So the objectives of fisheries have changed over time, although all four of these objectives still exist today in fisheries around the world. So the first objective, we assume, was to harvest enough fish to avoid starvation. So the first humans that were exploiting living resources from the sea would basically have no incentive to catch any more than were needed to keep themselves alive, because it's a lot of work to catch fish. And so you basically just want to harvest enough fish to avoid starvation. All right, so as societies advanced and human populations grew larger, and we invented money and more complex economic systems, then we created incentives for fishers to catch more fish than they could personally eat in order to sell them for money. And so all of a sudden now, instead of just wanting to catch as many fish as you need to eat, you want to catch as many fish as you possibly can, because you're going to use that money to enrich yourself and buy other things that you need. So after a while of objective 2, we realized that many fish populations around the world were getting depleted, and then objective 3 came about. Harvest as many fish as possible without compromising future harvests of that fish. So we want to be able to keep harvesting that fish and not run out. And so that means we can't harvest more than a certain amount now in order to maintain our harvest below a rate that the population can replenish. All right. So after sort of managing our fisheries based on the single species that we were focused on, we realized that we were causing environmental problems related to bycatch and other environmental harms and indirect ripple effects through the food chain. So even if we weren't harvesting too much of that one species, we were having these other negative harms to the structure, function, and biodiversity of the ecosystem, all things that are valuable intrinsically and also valuable to humans, as we learned about in the biodiversity and ecosystem function lecture. So now the most sophisticated objective of fisheries is to harvest as many fish as possible without compromising future harvests of that species, so that's the same as number 3, and without threatening the structure, function, or biodiversity of the ecosystem. So we also have to take care of the other impacts that we're having when we're fishing, such as impacts on non-targeted species or impacts on the environment through the fishing gear. So fisheries have really been important in human history and sort of the development of civilization and colonization of new lands and things like that. So ancient coastal societies from hunter-gatherer times to modern civilized times have depended upon fisheries resources, and the success of those societies and the peoples that lived and died for generations and generations were really dependent on harvesting these living resources from the sea. The early migrations, like across the Pacific Islands, were in part in search of new fishing grounds. Europeans who visited the Americas, some of the first ones to visit were the Basque fishermen from Spain. They were fishing in the waters off of Canada very early in the 16th century, maybe even before Columbus got there, um, in the 15th and 16th century. So the fisheries have been hugely important. But there have been some really unfortunate things to do with fisheries as well. So lots of conflicts have been caused due to these fights over fishing grounds, and the environment has suffered as well. So many fish stocks, which is a word for fish populations, have collapsed, meaning that the population's numbers have been brought to such a low level that their population has a hard time ever recovering. And some populations have been totally wiped out, either from a local area, which is called extirpation, or from the entire world, which is called extinction. So we've wiped out some great species, unfortunately. Right, so let's see if I can record a few more things about this slide, and I'll test it and see if it works out right. So the Caribbean monk seal also went extinct. It lived in the Caribbean, obviously, and went extinct about in the mid-20th century due to overharvesting, but it had already become rare in the previous centuries of European colonization. Stellar sea cow was a giant relative of the dugong and manatee that lived in the cold waters of the North Pacific Ocean, and that was hunted to extinction in the 18th and early 19th century. And the vaquita porpoise, I think, is not quite extinct yet, but it's a tiny, cute, endemic porpoise that lives in the Gulf of California, so between Mexico and the Baja Peninsula of Mexico. And it's not intentionally harvested, but it's caught as bycatch in fisheries, and the fisheries are poorly regulated, and not enough is being done to prevent the bycatch, and so the last vaquitas are disappearing now. All right, so modern fisheries, the global status of fisheries is something that you can get statistics on that are collected by this international governing body, the Food and Agriculture Association organization. So you can get up-to-date statistics on how many million tons of fish are being landed, which means being brought back to the dock and taken to the fish market. So when I made this slide, it was 80 million tons, worth about $50 billion, and it's been relatively steady for a while, so it's probably pretty similar to that now. And that's the legal landings, and we can estimate illegal landings as well. That's another fairly large amount. One thing that needs to be considered when you're looking at these statistics is the idea of landings versus catch. So landings is how much fish are brought back to the dock and weighed and sold. That is less than the amount that are caught, because some fish are discarded at sea. So that includes bycatch, things that you catch by accident and either can't sell or aren't allowed to sell and have to dump back into the ocean, or anything else that you, for whatever reason, don't bring back to the dock but still kill. And so fisheries, it's obviously a big deal. 80 million tons is a huge amount of protein that's being harvested from the ocean. And fish are a truly important food source in poor countries where they may not have other source of protein to ensure good health and well-being in the human population. Whereas in rich countries, we consume a lot of fisheries products as well, but we don't really need that protein to survive. It's more just a luxury product that we catch because we like to eat it. All right, so I mentioned catch is everything that you catch while you're out at sea, but not all of that makes it back to the dock. And so some of that stuff that doesn't make it back is what we call bycatch. So it's things that you were not trying to catch, which we call non-targeted species. So usually the bycatch is discarded. So that's about more than a quarter of the catch on average is things that either you can't or aren't allowed to sell, and you have to discard it overboard. So basically the stuff is dead after bringing it up, and you just shovel this stuff that you didn't want off the deck of the boat back into the water. So in some, the average amount of bycatch is 27%. In some fisheries it's less, and in some fisheries, like the shrimp trawl fisheries, it's actually much more than 27%. In some fisheries, the majority of the catch is bycatch. So you're actually catching and killing more stuff that you're not even selling than the amount that you're selling. So in shrimp fisheries it's bad because shrimp are small and you need a net that has small holes in it to catch the shrimp, but that means that you're also catching anything that's bigger than those small holes, which is a lot of unmarketable stuff. So the reasons that you have to discard the bycatch are it's either uneconomical to keep, meaning you can't sell it for any money, or it's illegal to keep. You're not allowed to sell it because it's an endangered species, or it's just too rare and you're not allowed to keep it. The thing is, in many fisheries, the discards are dead or dying, and you can throw them back in, but they're not going to live and swim away in many cases. So if they're going to die anyways, why do you think people aren't allowed to keep them? I mean, the stuff's already dead. Well, one of the main reasons is to remove the incentive to, quote, accidentally, end quote, catch things that you're not supposed to catch. So if you're like, oops, I accidentally caught this dolphin, I guess I have to sell it, then what's your incentive to not accidentally catch a dolphin again? So that's why even if you truly did catch something by accident, you're still not allowed to sell it. You have to throw it over. This is a picture of bycatch from a shrimp trawl. So you can see there are some shrimp in here, but there are a lot of other small fishes as well that won't be marketed and will just be thrown over dead. This alters marine ecosystems because it removes these bycatch species, and it also is sort of a subsidy of food for scavenging organisms. So some scavengers actually sort of are enhanced by these fisheries activities because they're able to feed on the bycatch of the fisheries. All right, so one of the saddest and most infamous types of bycatch is dolphin bycatch. When dolphins, particularly the spinner dolphin Stenella longirostris, are caught by accident in the pelagic tuna fisheries of the East Pacific. So these are the waters off of California and Mexico. And so starting in the 1950s, these tuna fleets started to use dolphins as an indicator of where the tuna were, because you'd see the dolphins jumping on the surface, and the dolphins and the tuna would be feeding on the same species of bait fish. And so the types of boats that would be harvesting these things were called purse seines, and purse seines string a net around an entire school of fish, and I'll sort of show how that works. So if this is, here's the surface of the ocean, and here's a school of fish. The purse seine has a little boat that has a net reel on it, and it unrolls the net around the entire school of fish, and the net as it unrolls has kind of like a top and a bottom. The top has floats, and then what they do is they pull a string that cinches the bottom together, and so the bottom cinches together, and it scoops up everything that was in there like the drawstring on a purse, and so that's why they call it a purse seine. And so it catches all the little fish that were in that area that was encircled by the net, but if there were dolphins in that area that was encircled by the net, it also catches them. So when we realized that the population of dolphins had declined by a huge amount, we enacted some laws to prohibit this targeting dolphins in order to get the tuna, and that changed the bycatch rate of dolphins in a good way. So we now only kill 1/20th as many dolphins as we used to, and the population of dolphins, which had been reduced to 20% of its original abundance, reduced by 80% to 20% of its original abundance, has now recovered to closer to its original abundance. The thing is that some nations still lobby for us to weaken our dolphin protection regulations, and they think that they're being discriminated against for having to be dolphin safe, particularly third world nations that might not have the technologies to fish in as safe a way as the richer countries. So there's an ongoing debate about this, and the dolphins aren't perfectly safe yet. So this is something that you should keep paying attention to. This is a picture of one of these purse seines being drawn in. So the seine is full of tuna, but you can also see that there are dolphins caught in the purse seine as well. One of the tragedies is that the adult dolphins actually would be able to jump out of the purse seine and escape in some cases, but the juvenile dolphins don't quite know what's happening, and they are not able to do that. And then the mother and father dolphins don't want to leave the baby dolphins, and so they end up staying and getting caught and killed in the net as well. All right, so I mentioned that the global fisheries now were somewhere around 80 million tons of legal catch a year, plus another 20 million tons or so of illegally caught fish. And so that's what this graph here shows. A big increase in the amount of fish that are caught from the 1950s to the 1980s, and then kind of like a leveling off after the 90s. And that's because we basically reached the limits of how many fish the ocean could provide. It wasn't because we started becoming more conscientious and enacting stricter laws. It was because there basically just weren't any more fish for us to catch. So basically the amount of fish caught went up and up and up as our capabilities to catch fish increased, but then they just couldn't go up any further because we're catching as many fish as the ocean was providing. Basically, like a large fraction of the fish that the ocean produces are now caught by human fishers. We said that the secondary production of all fish in the ocean was 0.2 times 10 to the 9th tons per year, and the average trophic level of fish in the ocean, assuming that production was about 4.54 is what we figured out for that. 4.54. We'll see if that actually recorded, and if I was able to save my picture of the food chain that I drew. All right, so if you look at these two numbers, this one is the amount of fish that the ocean is producing. This is the amount of fish that we're catching. We're catching over half of the fish that the ocean is producing, which is a huge amount of fish that are fish production that we're taking out of the ocean and using for human consumption. So it's pretty incredible. It's like we've pretty much just made the ocean our food bowl. So how do we catch over half of the fish that the ocean produces every year? We do it with different types of fishing gear. So there's two distinctions between, there's two major divisions in types of fishing gear. Active gear is gear that you move through the water to catch the fish. So trawls, like what's happening in this picture here. Dredges, which are sort of like a smaller version of a trawl that has more hard parts, and you scrape it across the bottom to catch shellfish for the most part. Seines, which are the nets that I described earlier for dolphins, well, for tuna that accidentally catch dolphins, and harpoons, so where you chase after something and shoot it with a spear, that's a harpoon. So harpoons are what we traditionally associate with whale hunting, but there are some very large fish in the ocean like swordfish and some tuna that used to be harvested with harpoons as well, although they're mostly harvested with other means now. So then there's passive gear. So passive gear doesn't move through the water, it sits there and catches things. So gill nets are nets that sort of float along at the surface usually, and they have holes in them that are about the same size as the fish that they want to catch, and the fish swim in and get stuck in the holes of the net, so the net clogs up with fish, and then you pull it back onto the boat and rip the fish out of the net to catch them. There's traps that sit on the bottom that are passive gear, and there's long lines. So a long line has like one long central line with a bunch of shorter lines that come off of it, and each of the shorter lines has a baited hook on it, and so you can have thousands and thousands of hooks on one long line, and each hook will potentially catch fish, although it could catch bycatch as well. This is an example picture of lobster traps, spiny lobster traps from the Florida Keys. So this is not active gear, this would be passive gear, an example of traps. All right, so there's a science associated with fisheries, and it's called fisheries science. It's a very exciting type of work for marine biologists to get into. You get to work with some of the most charismatic animals in the ocean, like the salmon shark in Alaska, a large predatory, well, most sharks are predatory, a large shark that is a really active predator and is actually the most warm-blooded fish in the world. It's studied by fish biologists for its ability to thermoregulate and maintain its core temperature much warmer than the cold waters it swims in, and that's what allows it to feed on salmon, hence the name salmon shark. Salmon are fast-swimming fish that are an important fishery species in their own right in the North Pacific Ocean. Right. Okay, so fishery science, it's the study of marine population, community, and ecosystem ecology as it relates to harvesting activities. So as it relates to the harvesting of living resources like fish, algae, shellfish out of the ocean. And it's interesting, especially even more so than other types of marine biology, it interfaces with socioeconomic and political science, and that forms the field of fisheries management. So sort of deciding how many fish we should be allowed to catch and who's going to be in charge of making sure that happens. So fisheries science has been around since the 19th century. It actually started in Scandinavia, where the Atlantic cod was a very, very important part of the economy. If the cod catches were good, the economy was doing great. If the cod catches were bad, everyone was unemployed and starving and things like that. And there seemed to be a lot of unpredictability in the cod harvest. Some years would be good years, some years would be bad years, and since this was such a strong influence on the economy, the powerful people in Norway decided that they would hire some scientists, a good idea, to figure out why it was that the cod populations were so variable from one year to the next. And they figured it out, sort of. So why did cod catches vary a lot from year to year? It turns out that the first few months of life is a highly variable period of survival for cod. Some years a lot of those young survive, and other years very few survive, and that means that there's a big difference from year to year in how many fish are making it to the young adult stage, which we call the young of year stage. So that process is called recruitment. Making it from a baby to a young adult is recruitment. And once a fish has recruited to the population, its survival is more predictable. It's less variable. So more recently, scientists have tried to understand what the causes of that variable recruitment are. And one sort of framework of theory that is now used to understand variable recruitment is the match-mismatch hypothesis developed by Cushing in 1969. And that was the idea that the survival of baby fish depends a lot on the physical conditions of the ocean and the availability of plankton for them to eat, although there might also be predators of the baby fish in the plankton. And if the baby fish are born into favorable physical conditions and have good plankton communities to feed on, and then the physical conditions bring them back toward shore as they mature and into the places where they can recruit and enter the next phase of their life, then you will have a lot of survival. You have basically a match between where the baby fish are being produced and where the good conditions for baby fish are, but other times you have a mismatch between where and when the baby fish are produced and where and when the good conditions for the survival of baby fish are happening. And so in those cases you don't get a lot of survival. Alright, so the goals of fisheries science are pretty straightforward. The first one is to figure out how many fish there are in the ocean. We can't just go out there and count fish with our eyes because we can't see very far underwater, we can't breathe underwater, and the ocean is big. So figuring out how many fish there are is much more difficult than you might think. And so that's why there's this whole field of fisheries science called stock assessment. And remember, stock is just a synonym for population. and it's the word for population that we use when we're talking about fish populations. All right, so once we know how many fish there are, then we need to know how many fish there are going to be in the future. And we usually do that on a year-to-year basis with population modeling. So we try to understand the population growth rate of the fish and extrapolate from the current population to what it's going to be like in the future. And then if we know where the population is at and where we think it's headed, then we know how many we can kill through harvesting. And if we know what the ideal or safe amount of that population to kill is, then we can try to translate that into laws through fisheries management. And then it ends up being sort of a cycle. You implement the fisheries management, and then you go back to the beginning and do another stock assessment to see if it worked, and if you're continuing to harvest at a sustainable rate, or if you need to sort of reevaluate. So it's a continuous cycle and keeps those fisheries scientists busy. So how do fisheries scientists figure out how many fish there are in the ocean? They rely on gathering data. So the two main ways that fisheries scientists gather data are going out and collecting it themselves, where the scientists go fishing. They call that fisheries independent data, or some people call it FIM for Fisheries Independent Monitoring. Florida's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, has an FIM, Fisheries Independent Monitoring program. And when the scientists go fishing, they're not trying to catch as many fish as they possibly can. They're trying to make an unbiased sampling of the fish population that's out there. And so to do that, they do what's called stratified random sampling. So if there's some large area that they need to sample, like here's a lake that's kind of oddly shaped, they wouldn't just do a bunch of samples in one spot of the lake, because then they might not really be sampling the whole thing. They would kind of divide the lake up into different sections, and then they would call those different sections strata, and then they'd make sure that they took a set number of samples, like towed the net a set number of times in each of those strata, to make sure that you were evenly and fairly surveying the entire range of that population. So that's called stratified random sampling. Another thing that fisheries scientists can do is mark recapture methods. So mark recapture methods are, so mark recapture methods are where you catch a fish and you put a tag on it. So here's a fish, and you stick it with some kind of tag, and the tag will have a little number on it, and when someone catches the fish later, you can tell that it had already been caught before and it was a tagged fish. So the way that you use mark recapture methods to figure out how many fish there are is you go fishing and you tag a certain number of fish, and you release them back into the ocean and let them mix in with the rest of the fish that are there. And then you go fishing again and you catch a bunch of fish again, and you see what proportion of fish have tags on them. So you can figure out the percent tagged to untagged, and then you can extrapolate from how many you tagged in the first place to and how many tags you recaught to how many total fish there must be in the population. So it's pretty simple math calculations for those mark recapture methods, although there are some assumptions that you have to make, like the fact that all the tagged fish survive and that they mix evenly in with the population. So there's a little bit more math to it, but the basics is simple. There are acoustic methods for assessing how many fish there are, which means that you're using sonar, so you're not actually catching the fish and bringing them up on the boat, but you're using fish finders basically to assess the size of the schools of fish. And obviously there's some limitations in that method because you can't always be sure what species of fish that you're looking at, and that sort of thing. For some species you can do visual counts. So for whales, for example, they're relatively easy to count because they come to the surface to breathe. Other species of fish that pass through uh, certain areas or come to certain areas to spawn can be counted, like salmon can be counted as they're coming back up streams, or a grouper can be counted at their mating aggregation sites. So visual counts sometimes work, particularly where the fish have to concentrate in a certain area at a certain time and can be counted there. Um, Also, you can estimate the amount of fish that are out there spawning by counting the amount of eggs and larvae in the plankton. So even if you're not able to catch the adults, if you see tons of eggs and larvae of that fish in the plankton, then you know that there's a lot of adults out there spawning. So those are all ways that fisheries scientists can monitor data independently, meaning independent of the fishermen themselves. Okay, so fisheries dependent data is where the scientists get data from the fisheries themselves. So the fisheries, that's the people that are going out and harvesting fish for money, they have to report how many fish they catch. And those data are logged, and the scientists have access to that data, so they can see how many fish the fishermen caught, and they also have to report how long they were at sea and where they were and things like that. So that provides data that fisheries scientists can use to figure out if catches are increasing or declining and that sort of thing. So part of it is just relying on these honorable reports from the fishers. But then, especially on larger fishing boats, they'll often have a scientist on board the boat who is an observer and sort of is looking over their shoulders and counting fish and making sure that they're not breaking the law and trying to keep track of how many fish they catch. If you're a recent college graduate, you can apply to be a fisheries observer. It's kind of a tough job. You're on a boat with a bunch of people that might not necessarily like you or appreciate what you're doing, but it's a really good way to get your feet wet in fisheries science, and you're playing an important role in protecting the environment and keeping fisheries sustainable. Something that fisheries scientists can do with the data from fisheries is figure out catch per unit effort, which is abbreviated CPUE. So that means catch per unit effort means how many fish were caught per how hard the fishermen were fishing. So if you only had catch data, you wouldn't know whether they caught all those fish in like one day, in just a couple hours, or if that took a month at sea to catch that many fish. And you can sort of assume that if you caught a lot of fish in a short amount of time, that would be a high catch per unit effort, and it would suggest that there's a lot of fish out there. Whereas if the fish are getting scarce, you might catch the same amount of fish, but it would take you a longer time to do that. And so from catch per unit effort data, you can make inferences about the size and health of the population. And if catch per unit effort is declining, even if total catch is staying steady, it suggests that the fishery stock is being depleted. So when when fisheries scientists get fish from the fishery, they can do other types of research with those fish that are caught by the fishermen as well, like age and growth studies. They can count rings in the fish's ear bones, which are called otoliths, to figure out how old the fish are, and then you measure how big the fish are, and you can figure out what the growth rate of the fish are. You can study sort of the age structure of the population to see how many fish are surviving to a certain age. And so there's actually a lot of interesting fisheries science that can be done with the fisheries dependent data. And another advantage of the fisheries dependent data is that the fishermen are going out and catching fish anyways, and so you don't need like tax money to pay for the boats to go out and collect that data. It's being collected for you. There are some disadvantages of fisheries dependent data though, and one of them is that the fisheries are not trying to sample in an unbiased way like the scientists would be. They're trying to just go wherever the most fish are to catch. And so sometimes even if the total fish population was declining, if the fisheries were going to where the last remaining ones were fleeing, they might still be catching a lot right up until the last minute when they've depleted the fisheries. So fisheries independent data is really valuable. Alright, so once you have the data, you need to figure out how many fish there are going to be in the future. So you need to know what the population is doing. and you have to be able to model or predict what's going to happen in the fish populations. And so that population modeling can get really complicated. So you not only have to account for sort of the birth and death rates of that fish species, but you also have to account for the rate of fishing mortality, so the effects of people fishing on that species, but also natural predators and food availability for that species. You have to deal with the fact that the ocean is an open environment, so fish aren't like localized in one area. They can move in from somewhere else or move out to another area, and it can be really hard to monitor the entire habitat that these fish might be roaming through and make predictions. So modeling what's going on with fish populations is very difficult. But one of the basic concepts is something that you've already learned about, and that's the logistic growth model, where the change in number of individuals per unit time is equal to a constant growth rate times the number of individuals in the population times this term here, which causes a leveling out when the population gets near the carrying capacity K. So this is the logistic population growth rate model, and I'll say a little bit more about that model and how it's used in some basic fisheries models. Okay, so there's this classic concept in fisheries science called maximum sustainable yield, and this concept is based on that logistic growth model. So maximum sustainable yield would be the most that you can take from a stock of fish per year, usually, without exceeding its natural rate of regrowth. So if you were exceeding its natural rate of regrowth, that wouldn't be sustainable, because each year the population would be smaller until it was gone. But if you're not exceeding its natural rate of regrowth, then you can continue to take that same amount year after year. And so it's basically like, what's the biggest amount that you could take every year and still not deplete the population? So it turns out if we run the mathematical predictions with this simple model, we're reducing the stock to about 50% of its virgin biomass. Virgin biomass means the amount of the size of the population before anybody started fishing them. So just in its natural state, what was the size of the fish population? That's the virgin biomass. Oftentimes the size of fish populations is measured not in numbers, but in biomass, like the weight of individuals out in the environment. So that's where that term comes from. And so I'll explain how this calculation of the optimum, the maximum sustainable yield at 50% of virgin biomass came about. So it's interesting. This means that you are reducing the fish population to 50% of what it was historically before fishing, which seems pretty drastic, but actually, by the math, that's what gives you your maximum sustainable yield. So that's pretty intense fishing. So if you want to calculate maximum sustainable yield, you need to know a lot of things. You need to know the size of the fish population, N. You need to know the intrinsic rate of growth of the fish population. You need to know the carrying capacity of the environment, so like at what population size does the population growth stop in sort of that would be in the virgin biomass condition. And yeah. All right, so here is a time series of a population going from a small size to its carrying capacity K. Would be K, would be at this level here at the top where the population levels off at. If a population starts very small, it will slowly increase for a while, then it'll hit this point of rapid increase where the population size is about halfway to the carrying capacity K over 2. So this is a population size of 0. And so there's a steep slope, rapid growth when you are at about half of the carrying capacity. So So basically what this is showing is that there's rapid regrowth of the population um, when you're in this zone where the population size has been reduced. Whereas if you're in this zone where the population is near its maximum, the rate of growth is slower. And if you're at a really low population size, the rate of growth is slower here as well. So you can see the slope of these arrows if you have too little numbers in the population or too many numbers in the population are less, whereas this rate of regrowth is highest in this sort of mid-range of the graph where you're about halfway to carrying capacity. So there are other ways to visualize this as well. So instead of looking at time on the x-axis, we can sort of flip this around. And now what was the y-axis is now the x-axis. So we're looking at population size from 0 to k on the x-axis now. So here's where the population is at its maximum size, and here's where the population is very small. And then on this y-axis, this is how fast the population is growing. So when the population is low, the population is not growing very fast because there's not much to build off of. And when the population is really high, the population is not growing very fast because population growth is slow due to being near the carrying capacity and having resources be scarce for those fish. So the fish are starving and fighting each other and running out of room. And therefore their population growth rate is slow. But when you're in this happy medium range, this is when you have a large amount of population growth per year because you've got enough individuals to build off of, but you don't have so many individuals that are getting in each other's way and reducing the amount that they can reproduce. So that's why the idea of harvesting, lowering the population size down to about half of its original size, gets you to this point of rapid regrowth. And so you want to just keep depleting the population to about half its original size, because that's where you're going to get the fastest regrowth and you're going to be able to sustain the maximum yield. So that idea of maximum sustainable yield is the most basic goal of fishery science, but a lot of times harvesting as many fish as you possibly can without depleting permanently the fish population, it's not always the optimum. Sometimes you can actually get more economic benefit if you fish less, because the amount you get from selling the fish minus the amount that you have to spend to catch the fish is more favorable when there's a lot of fish out there, because if there's a ton of fish out there, you can catch a lot without having to spend much time on the water. And the more you reduce the population, the harder and longer you have to fish to fill up your boat with fish. And so it's like a trade-off. All right, and so oftentimes the optimum sustainable yield is less than the maximum sustainable yield, meaning you would have to fish not as much and you wouldn't reduce the population as much below its virgin biomass in the optimum sustainable yield situation. So something to note about this maximum sustainable yield idea is that the math looks really nice on paper when it's just in theory, but the relationship between population size and population growth rate, which we modeled as that sort of hump-shaped thing where, pop size and then population growth rate were this like nice predictable relationship where when the population size was halfway to the carrying capacity, you'd have the maximum population growth rate. That is a nice prediction to make, but the actual relationship between population growth rate and population size, the actual relationship is kind of fuzzy. Like if you were looking at real data, it wouldn't necessarily fit right on the line. And so the way we know that is by trying to draw these things that we call stock recruitment curves. So it's basically a graph of the adult population size versus the number of new recruits added to the population, which is the population growth rate. So I'll show you some stock recruitment curves and hopefully you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about. All right, so here's an example of some different sort of models of stock recruitment curves. So on the x-axis here you've got spawning stock biomass. So this is the amount of adults, and this is the number of recruits, so the number of babies that are added to the population that year versus the amount of adults in the population. So you can see there's a general trend that if you have far too few adults in the population, then you're not going to get very many recruits added. And as you increase the number of adults in the population, you generally get more babies added to the population up until you kind of reach some maximum point, and then things either level off or start to decline due to carrying capacity problems. If there's a whole lot of adults in the population, maybe not that many babies will make it into the population due to competition. The thing is that the actual data doesn't land right on any of these predicted lines. The actual data, like the actual number of recruits for any given level of population, is distributed in sort of like a statistical bell curve. So if the if the spawning stock biomass is X, then you would predict that the number of recruits would be Y, right here. But actually it could be more than that, it could be less than that, could be a lot more than that, could be a little more than that, and that's where you're sort of drawing this bell curve. So like you would expect it to be right here in the center of the bell curve, but the actual numbers that you observe could be sort of distributed somewhat randomly within that distribution. And we can see that if we look at actual data, stock recruitment data. So this is actual spawning stock biomass. So this is the adult population size here, and this is the recruits, so the number of babies added to the population. And this is the predicted line. So you predict that the more adults that you have, the more recruitments you'll get up to a point, then you expect it to taper off. But the actual data, and these are marked by the years that the data came from, they're scattered way widely around the line. So this shows that it's really a big problem with variable recruitment. And it's hard to even know what the underlying pattern is when there's so much variation. I mean, sometimes you have a relatively small population and yet you get a whole bunch of babies. Other times you have a higher population, but you don't get very many babies added to the population. So it's really tough to predict and deal with that natural variability when you're managing fisheries. So let's talk about where fisheries management goes wrong, where we end up overfishing. And overfishing is something that happens so often that we actually have characterized the classic pattern of overfishing as 4 stages. The first stage is the development of the fishery. So a new fish stock is discovered, like, oh hey, we can eat these fish that are living in this part of the world, and all of a sudden there's a race to exploit those fish. The harvests rapidly increase and reach the second stage, which is full exploitation. So the population has been reduced to about 50% of its original abundance. Maximum sustainable yield has been reached. The thing is that we don't usually stop there. More people continue to start fishing and harvesting that stock, and we end up at overexploitation. So we reduce the stock below 50% of its original abundance, harvests surpass the maximum sustainable yield, and the size of the fish population declines to a low level. And when the stock biomass reaches a really low level, less than 10% of its unexploited biomass, we said that it has collapsed. And after that, if we ease up on the fishing, then the population may recover, or the population may not recover. It may continue to go down, and the population may eventually be wiped out from that area, which is called extirpation. So not all species are equally vulnerable to overfishing. Some species are especially vulnerable. They are less resilient to fishing than others. And so if there's a certain amount of fishing happening in an area, then the species that are more vulnerable to overfishing, if they're caught in that same fishery, they're the ones that are going to go extinct first, because they're not able to replenish their populations as fast as they're being wiped out. Whereas maybe some other species that are being caught in those same nets, their populations regrow faster, so they won't actually go extinct from that same level of fishing. So a lot of the impacts of fishing are dependent on how vulnerable those particular fish species are. So what are the life history factors that affect the susceptibility of fish? So life history factors mean like the lifespan of the fish, how long it takes for the fish to reach maturity, how many babies the fish makes, um, how often the fish spawns. Those kind of things affect the susceptibility of the species a lot. So some of the factors that make fish really vulnerable to overfishing. Um, this is a sad fish here. He's really vulnerable to overfishing. Um, so he has a slow growth rate, late maturity, lower inconsistent fecundity, meaning like might not even spawn every year, localized distribution, so easy for the fishermen to find and catch them all, and so they're very susceptible to overfishing. So something like a grouper would have all these factors working against it and be very vulnerable to overfishing, whereas something that has fast life cycle, quick reproduction, and sort of this really prolific spawning is less vulnerable to overfishing because they're able to sort of recover from overharvesting rapidly. But the flip side of these small fish that have short, rapid life cycles is that their abundances, if you look at the number of fish over time, their abundances tend to be quite variable just naturally because of variable recruitment. So that's the sort of flip side of the equation, where these fish that are less susceptible to overfishing are pretty variable even just with the natural factors. Alright, so one of the fish that is extremely vulnerable to overfishing is the orange roughy Hoplostuthis atlanticus. So it's a really deep water fish that lives in cold waters with limited amounts of food, and it grows and reproduces really slowly. They can live to be over 100 years old. And so in some parts of the world they have had large virgin biomasses, meaning that there's a lot of fish down there. It's just that those populations are not replenishing themselves fast. And so fishermen, like, I'm not sure if this fellow is a fisherman or a scientist, but he's got an orange roughy. So they, the fishermen, when they find that, oh my gosh, there's a huge amount of these fish down in the deep ocean, let's harvest them, they go and do that, and they harvest them probably at the same rate that they harvest shallow water fish. They grow back faster, and then they realize that those deep water fish aren't regrowing their populations at nearly the rate that the shallow water species they're used to do, and so you just rapidly deplete their populations and have to move on to another area and deplete those populations. So other species that are really susceptible to overfishing, anything in the elasmobranch group, which is the cartilaginous fishes like the sharks and rays, they are much less fecund than most bony fishes, have relatively few young at each reproductive event, and they take longer to reach reproductive maturity. So in the North Sea, which is the continental shelf waters off of northern Europe, the community biomass is somewhat depleted in fish overall, but it's extremely depleted in sharks and rays. So there's a lot of fishing there, and the bony fishes that are able to bounce back from that overfishing are still hanging in there. They're only 38% depleted. But the cartilaginous fishes, the sharks and rays, are extremely depleted in that area. It's really hard to find a shark or a ray in the waters off of northern Europe because there's been such intense fishing there for so many years that their populations have been virtually exterminated. Other species that have the same problem are marine mammals like whales, dolphins, seals, and sea lions, and manatees and dugongs. I mentioned one of the dugong species, the stellar sea cow, that was actually hunted to extinction, for example. Seabirds, also slow reproducing, long-lived species. that are not always intentionally harvested, but they're caught as bycatch in fisheries, and their populations are really susceptible to fishing impacts. Same deal with sea turtles, which are often caught as bycatch in net and longline fisheries, and their populations can't handle that mortality. All right, so how do you prevent these negative impacts of fishing, like the extirpation of the fish species and destruction of the environment, and ensure the sustainability of the fishery for perpetuity? Well, it's a really tough job. So we talked about the science part, some of the science part already. We talked about stock assessment, where you see how many fish there are, um, age and growth studies, where you see how many young versus old fish there are, how fast the fish are growing, and then combining those two types of data, you can do population modeling to figure out, try to estimate how many fish there's going to be in the future. You can do ecological monitoring to see how the ecosystem is doing, and ecosystem modeling to try to tie all of the information that you have about the environment and the fish and the fishing together. And that science part is only the first part, and that's the crazy thing. So even if you get the science perfectly right and you understand exactly what's going on with the fish population, how it's impacted by people, you still have to do the other part, which is coming up with laws that will protect the fish and getting those laws enacted and getting support for them and doing all of that economic and political stuff to make those science-based regulations actually happen, which is very difficult. Because oftentimes what's best for the sustainability of a fish population is really unpopular, particularly with the fishers, because oftentimes it will affect them economically negatively in the short term, even though ultimately um, the sustainability of the fish stock is in the best interest of the fishers as well. Oftentimes, there's disagreement about whether they really need to do something, or is the science being too strict, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of pressure from the politicians and fishermen and all the folks that we call stakeholders, those people who have a stake in what happens to the fishery. So coming up with and enforcing laws and regulations is tricky as well, because you don't just have to come up with laws that protect the fish. You have to come up with laws that will be acceptable and popular and get passed and be enforceable. So different and there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different things that we can do that work for different fisheries in different parts of the world. So there's a variety of what we call those management tools. So different types of laws and regulations that may work better or worse in particular fisheries of the world. Okay, so here are some of those tools in the toolbox of fisheries management. One is catch controls, which is basically limits on the numbers of fish that you can catch. So that could be like a total number of cod that can be caught from the North Atlantic in a year. That would be a total. Or you could have a quota, like each fishing boat can only catch a certain amount this season. So that would be a type of catch control. And then the very most strict type of catch control is what we call a moratorium. So a moratorium means you can't catch any fish at all. So the quota is 0. Moratorium. Okay, so moratorium means like death. So like the fish, we're killing the fishery, you're not allowed to catch any. So that's obviously not popular with the fishermen, because they'd like to be able to catch some fish. But in some cases, a moratorium is a very effective type of catch control, because it gives the fish a total break from fishing that can allow them to recover if their population's been severely depleted. All right, another type of fisheries management tool is effort control. So you're just trying to reduce the amount of fishing, and you're not having an exact limit that you've set. You just want to reduce the amount that are caught somehow. So one way that you can do that is by selling. The government sort of will give out a limited number of licenses that make sure that not too many people are fishing and depleting that particular fish population. There could be quotas on effort, like you're only allowed to fish for 1 month of the year. or you're only allowed to go out a certain number of times. And there could be vessel or gear restrictions, like you have to go out in a small boat, it can't have a refrigerator on board, or you can't use a net that's bigger than this many meters or has smaller than this amount of mesh size. And some of those things get into what we call technical measures, which are like really technical measures to make sure that the gear is less harmful or it doesn't catch too much bycatch and things like that. So limits on your net must have holes in it that are at least this big so that the small fish can escape through the net, or we might have like a complicated pattern of certain areas that are closed off to fishing, or seasons that are closed off to fishing to protect sensitive habitats or to protect fish when they're in their spawning aggregations and things like that. And those technical measures can be really specific to the individual fish population depending on how the fishery works and where the vulnerable places are. The video that you can go to in this link is about a technical measure that is required now on shrimp trawls in the Gulf of Mexico, and I think other parts of the world too, that excludes sea turtles. So this is supposed to be a sea turtle, and the sea turtles tend to get caught in the fishing nets, but with this turtle excluder device, it kicks the sea turtles out of the net and and still catches the fish. So that's good for the turtles, and it's also good for the fishermen because it lets them get more fish in their net. So any of these four measures can, or sorry, three types of controls can work if and only if the enforcement is effective. So you can have a law that exists on paper, but if there's no enforcement of it, it might as well not exist because people are going to break that law. All right, so let's talk about one of those technical measures that we mentioned, and that was closed areas, also known as marine protected areas. So it's basically a set-aside geographic area in the ocean where you're not allowed to fish, or at least there's really serious restrictions on the amount and type of fishing that you can do in that area that are much stricter than the surrounding areas. And so those marine protected areas can definitely benefit the fishery because they reduce catch mortality within the marine protected area and allow fish populations to grow and replenish themselves in the protected area. So it obviously benefits the fish. And also, if the fishing has destructive effects on the habitat, like the trawl nets scrape the bottom, having an area where the whole environment is protected from the destructive fishing benefits other species in the environment as well. And the marine protected areas, it might seem like they have no benefit to the fishery because you're not allowed to fish in a marine protected area, so how could it possibly benefit the fishermen? But actually, a lot of times, if you have like a certain area of the ocean, here's the seafloor, and so let's say there's a reef here, and it's a particularly valuable area, and so it's marked off with buoys. This is a marine protected area. You're not allowed to fish in this marine protected area. And so then the fish population starts to grow in the marine protected area. And as the fish population grows, a lot of those fish, eventually when it starts to get crowded in the marine protected area, will stray out into the unprotected areas where they can be caught by the fishermen, and then the fishermen are happy because they're catching fish and the fishery benefits. Okay. All right, so there's an interesting example of a marine protected area in Florida, and that's the Kennedy Space Center. So the Kennedy Space Center is the area where from the mid-20th century to the present, although less so now, NASA, I can't remember exactly what NASA stands for, but they're the people that launch rocket ships. They're based well, they have bases in various places, but where many of their space launches occur is on the east coast of Florida, on this barrier island system. This is Cape Canaveral here, this point of land that sticks out into the ocean. And behind Cape Canaveral, there is a system of estuaries, including the Banana River Lagoon. Um, and these are really productive waters that have a lot of seagrass beds and a lot of inshore game fishes such as red drum, spotted sea trout, black drum, and most of the Banana River Lagoon system and the other inland waters of Florida are heavily fished, but there is a strict no-take zone enforced in this NASA area where they don't even let people take boats in, even not to fish, because they don't want people getting close to the rockets or spies stealing the secrets of the rockets and things like that. And it's been like that since the 1960s. And so that means that the fish in this lagoon have had a very long break from being caught by fishermen. And interestingly, a number of studies have been done on the size and abundance of fish in this area and just outside. And one of the things that sort of shows the benefits of protected areas for the fisheries is that there's been a spillover of very large game fish just outside of this protected area. And so, interestingly, like 10 to 25 years after the protected area was established in 1960, you started to see these catches of record-sized game fish just outside the fished area, because that's sort of how long it took for these fish to reach these whopper sizes and the fish populations to get big enough that the ones that were in the protected area started spilling out and getting caught. All right, so another cool story about protected areas is with not a fin fish, but bivalve mollusk, what we would call a shellfish. It's the sea scallop Placoplecten magellanicus. This is the one that makes the big scallop meats, which you would find in fancy seafood. And they are abundant on the continental shelf off the northeast coast of the USA, or at least they used to be, but they're really heavily depleted by dredge and trawl fisheries that scrape the bottom and catch tons of them. So this was such a problem that the bottoms were of the continental shelf off the northeastern United States was really getting scraped bare of scallops, and it was bad not just from a perspective of depleting the scallop abundance, but because the scallops with their shells would sort of create almost like a reef-like structure on the bottom where juvenile fish and shrimps and crabs and things could hide. And so it was this whole kind of ecosystem structure that was being lost as the scallops were being over-harvested. So in order to protect the scallops and sort of allow the seabed structure to reform, they instituted these protected areas. So areas of the continental shelf were closed off. So this was MPAs, the closed areas. So that was part of their strategy. But they didn't just use MPAs. They also they instituted some other technical measures like a minimum dredge mesh size so that they wouldn't catch immature scallops, so that in the areas where they were fishing, they would at least be letting the baby scallops survive. And there were some effort limits, so the number of fishermen that could be on the boat, the number of days that the boat could stay on the water were reduced to limit the number of scallops that could be caught. And then the only one of these measures that was actually popular with the fishermen is that some of the closed areas after the scallops had been allowed to recover were reopened, and so that sort of demonstrated to the fishermen that, like, oh wow, there really is big, relatively rapid recovery in the areas where we stopped fishing, and doing that on a rotating basis to give places a break to recover and then fishing them again actually worked out ultimately to the benefit of the scallop fishermen as well. So this is sort of a map that shows some of the closed areas where you're not allowed to fish scallops, and you can see them on the continental shelf. This is Boston here, Boston Harbor, and Cape Cod, and I think this is Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So this is the waters off of New England, And the color-coded specks here show, based on the GPS trackers on the scallop boats, where they were fishing the most. And it's interesting that the areas that they fished most intensely were oftentimes right along the edges of the protected areas, like here, because the protected areas were working and it was a spillover of scallops from the protected areas to the adjacent areas that were actually sort of the most productive areas to fish. All right, so there are some success stories like the scallop protection in New England for fisheries, but fisheries management, it often fails. You know, there are laws that are intended to protect the fishery, but it ends up, overharvesting ends up happening anyways. So why is that? Well, um, we'll talk about some of the ways that fisheries fail, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why they fail. So um, what one of the big fails of fishing is when harvest mortality is too high. So basically, it just means you're catching too many fish. Harvest mortality means catching and killing through the harvest. So you can have high mortality of the thing that you're trying to catch, and you can have high mortality of the bycatch, the things that you weren't even trying to catch. We'll talk about the evolutionary impacts of fishing, something that I call unnatural selection. We'll talk about habitat-mediated indirect effects, where we mess up the habitat and that indirectly has bad effects. And then we'll talk about trophic-mediated indirect effects, where we mess up the food chain and that messed up food chain affects the environment. So these are all harmful impacts of fisheries. And some of those harmful impacts are summarized in this nice infographic here. So harvest mortality, that's the direct effect of basically there were fish and now you caught them and there are no longer fish. That changes things. There are physical impacts of the fishing gear, particularly gear that drags across the bottom, like trawl gear. You can kind of see how there's this complex, lush bottom environment that's being torn down to rubble by the physical impacts of the fishing gear. And that habitat modification or destruction can indirectly have other negative effects, changing how the food chain works and habitat value and productivity of the sea bottom environment, since this is really good and this environment here that's been damaged by the fishing gear is less productive. There's the effects of bycatch. So there's the direct removal of the things that were caught in the bycatch, but then there's also this indirect effect of all that waste that's being dumped into the water. And so one of the things that happens as fishing increases is you start to lose all these big fish, the structure of the environment is destroyed, and the fish that are remaining are small and low in the food chain. So there's a decline in mean trophic level. That's what that means. All right, so let's talk about this unnatural selection idea. So natural selection is a term from evolutionary biology. And so natural selection means where sort of the forces of nature favor the survival of individuals that are better adapted to their environment, and they pass on their genes, and you end up selecting for characteristics that help the organism survive in its environment. And so anything that causes differential mortality, that's something that sort of weeds out the poorly adapted organisms and favors the well-adapted organisms, can be considered natural selection. But unnatural forces, man-made forces, can also select for or against certain traits in a wild population. And fisheries is a huge source of mortality. They remove as much as 90% of a fish population every year. And it's not just 90% at random. There is some selectiveness, at least potentially, in what types of fish are removed by fishing. So what do you think would be some fish genetic and phenotypic characteristics that would make them more or less vulnerable to being fished? So I mentioned, I think on one of the really early slides, that the big fish tend to be wiped out first, and the small fish might be the ones that survive because they can slip through the net or they're thrown back by the fishermen. So that's one obvious characteristic that might be inadvertently selected for by overfishing, is smaller fish size, but there's some other ones that are related to that we'll talk about on the next slides. All right, so this graphic here shows, um, well, it's complicated because there's 3 rows, but let's just look at part A first. So that's this top part here. So this is the characteristics of a natural fish population. So naturally, there's, if you look at the amount of fish versus the size or age of the fish, there are a lot of young fish and there are not a lot of old fish. There will never be more old fish than there are, well, there should really be more old fish than there are young fish, because there's millions of eggs are produced and then very few survive to old age. So there's sort of like a gradual decrease in abundance. For the larger and older you are, the less likely you are to still be alive. All right, so that's kind of a natural thing. And then there's this maturity thing. So fish start out immature, and then when they hit puberty, they become mature and able to reproduce. And that's sort of a threshold thing. Like, you are really unlikely to have hit puberty until you get to a certain age, then you're really likely to have hit puberty. And, for fish, that means being able to spawn. And natural populations are not perfectly level throughout time. They do vary, but it's usually like a not extreme amount of variability. Okay, so when you introduce fishing into this system, it changes this natural system a little bit. So fishing really hits the larger fish hard. It selectively removes the bigger, larger fish. And so that sort of shifts the distribution of the fish population towards more of the small fish. So some of the small fish are caught too, but by and large, it's the large fish that are most dramatically reduced, and the small fish are not as affected. And so that means that the mature fish are sort of being removed, and and it's sort of creating a selective pressure for fish to mature faster, because you're not so likely to reach a large size or age. So if you can hit puberty earlier when you're smaller and younger, you at least have a chance of reproducing before you get to the size where you probably will have been caught by the fishery. And in these populations that are affected by fishing, they're more variable over time, because there aren't that many large old organisms, and the organisms have this sort of rapid growth and reproduction cycle, where their population is really affected by variable recruitment and things like that. And these immediate effects of fishing can sort of be encoded in the genes after generations of natural selection, to where the fish, it's just not genetically as large as it used to be, and it's genetically maturing at a younger age than it was usually, and it's inherently less stable in population size than it used to be. So these effects of fishing can become sort of permanent when we sort of cause our fish to evolve into smaller and earlier maturing species. Okay, another destructive impact of fishing is habitat modification, habitat destruction. An obvious example is blast fishing. This is where we use dynamite or homemade explosives to stun fish and cause some of them to float to the surface where we can easily harvest them. And a really negative effect of this is that it busts up whatever structures are on the bottom, like the corals, and it destroys the habitat. So you get the fish in the short term, but you destroy the productivity of the fishing environment in the long term, because you're destroying the habitat that allows those fish to feed and grow and survive to the larger age. So this is really, really unsustainable. Kant would not approve of this blast fishing. And blast fishing is kind of a third world thing. It's used in poor countries where they don't have many other means of catching fish. But there are some equally destructive, if not more destructive, means of fishing that humans in first world countries use. And one of the worst ones is trawling. So trawling is where you tow a net over the bottom and it scrapes along the bottom to catch fish that are associated with the bottom. And How bad trawling impacts the bottom depends a bit on the type of habitat and the natural disturbance regime. So if you're trawling in an area that's frequently swept over by strong currents and waves anyway, and it's just kind of a sand or mud bottom, then the trawling might not be that much worse than what's happening sort of due to natural disturbances, and it might not be such an unsustainable thing. But if you're trawling in an area that's not normally disturbed, where there are delicate, slow-growing, long-lived structures on the bottom like deep-sea corals and stuff, then trawling is really, really destructive. All right, so some areas of the continental shelf, particularly like the waters off of the North Sea of Europe, are swept by trawls 10 to 15 times per year. So it's hard to imagine any kind of rich invertebrate community of corals and sponges and hydroids and things developing on the seabed in an area where multiple times, like a month sometimes, that same area will be trawled over by a net. You just can't develop the habitat structure in those areas. It would be like you're not going to get a forest growing on a lawn that's mowed every month. Likewise, you're not going to get complex habitats and biodiverse systems developing in areas that are trawled every month. All right, so here's one of these areas where you should really not trawl. It is a deep sea reef where you've got these really fragile, slow growing biogenic structures, the deep sea corals, and they support small fishes and invertebrates that support the food chain that leads to larger fishes like this Atlantic cod here. And if you trawl over one of these areas, it just turns it to mud and rubble, and it can take hundreds, if not thousands of years for these extremely slow-growing biogenic habitats to develop. So once this is gone, it could be an incredibly long time before this environment will ever have the productivity and diversity that it had before. So this is a classic example of an unsustainable practice. All right, so let's talk about some of the regulations that have been put forth to protect the fish stocks of the world. We'll focus on the United States and our primary piece of fisheries protection legislation at the federal level, and that's the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries and Conservation Management Act of 1976. So this came about in the a little bit after the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which were also really important environmental movement efforts that help protect the environment, at least to some extent, in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s. And the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act was sponsored by senators from Washington State and Alaska, places where fisheries were recognized as being very important, and they were worried about overfishing and killing the golden goose, so to speak, by overfishing to the point that they couldn't fish anymore. So originally the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act called to optimally exploit the fishery stocks of the United States and achieve maximum sustainable yield. So it was basically said that everywhere possible we should be fishing at maximum sustainable yield, and so that meant that areas where we were overfishing, we should stop overfishing, but also it meant that areas that hadn't had fisheries developed in them yet but could potentially be fished more could be fished more. So this didn't just reduce fishing, it sort of promoted fishing for better or worse. And since the initial law was passed, there have been a lot of changes and reauthorizations. One of the changes, besides just going for maximum sustainable yield, were provisions to protect what is called essential fish habitat. So this idea of essential fish habitat is that there are some waters and substratum means the bottom environment, that are particularly important for the spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity of a particular species. So there's definitely like hot spots for species, like some species of fish really are dependent on coral reefs or seagrass beds or particular estuarine regions where they spawn or have a life stage. And so we need to make extra effort to protect those habitats or protect the fish while they're in those habitats. And so this part of the legislation has been used to protect a lot of the habitats associated with the fish. one of the tricky things when implementing this law, though, is it's tough to say when a habitat is absolutely necessary. Like there are many types of fish that might benefit from seagrass beds, but they could also survive in a different habitat, like seaweed beds or other types of estuarine habitats. And so they might not be strictly dependent on seagrass beds, and so it's tough to say that those seagrass beds are truly essential. So this is a point of argument. This is an example of essential fish habitat for a Pacific rockfish. This is a sponge in deep waters on the continental shelves, and these sponges, where the juvenile rockfish live in the first stages of their life, are really important and really vulnerable to trawl fishing, which knocks over the sponges, and the sponges don't grow back very fast. Here's a rocky bottom near the coast in Alaska, and you can see that there's a bunch of Alaskan king crabs that are sheltering under this rock when they're juveniles. So these rocky, shallower water habitats are important fish habitat for these shellfish, the crabs. Okay, so another type of negative impact of fishing is what we call trophic mediated ecosystem impacts. This means negative impacts that are caused by changes in the food chain. That's where the word trophic comes from. And so they're indirect effects on other species mediated by changes in food web structure caused by removal of target species. So basically, picture a food web, picture taking one of the species out of that linked food web, and how the rest of the food web sort of adjusts or collapses around that one species that's been removed. So one of those examples of ripple effects through the food web after you change the abundance of one species is a trophic cascade. And the classic trophic cascade is the kelp beds example. So in Alaska anyways, when sea otters were removed from kelp beds, it led to a trophic cascade where sea urchins increased and the kelp was overgrazed by the overabundant sea urchins. Whereas in California kelp beds, that didn't really happen because initially, at least, there were other species in California that were able to eat the sea urchins, so it didn't matter as much that the sea otters were gone. So some of those other species in California that were able to eat sea urchins were fish like this California sheepshead type of wrasse that eats sea urchins, and this California spiny lobster that eats sea urchins when the sea urchins are small. So in California, even though the sea otters were depleted, the spiny lobsters and the sheepshead were sort of able to make up for it, and this food web in California kelp beds sort of was relatively stable and survived that initial trophic impact of the overharvest of the sea otter. The kelp beds now are sort of under threat, though, because the spiny lobster and the sheepshead are also being overharvested. People like to eat sheepshead and spiny lobster, and that means that the urchins are becoming quite abundant and overgrazing the giant kelp. And so what do you think the solution would be here? I would think it would be bring back the sea otters, bring back the lobsters, bring back the sheepshead. But actually the solution in some people's minds is, well, let's just kill the urchins too. And so now there's this human fishery that's developed to get rid of the sea urchins and sell them for consumption in Asian markets. And so this is the sea urchin fishery. So sea urchins being sort of the one thing that's still left in the California kelp beds, that's the new target. So beware of this kind of thing where people are proposing more fishing as the solution to overfishing. I don't think that this is particularly scientifically, I don't think that this is really an ethically or scientifically sound way to go. All right, we talked about fishing on continental shelf environments in cold temperate areas. We talked about kelp beds. Let's say something about coral reef fishing, because coral reefs are abundant throughout the tropics, or at least historically were, and there's a lot of fish productivity on coral reefs. You can have 5 tons per kilometer squared of fish being produced on a coral reef environment, and if the harvest is done carefully, you can have good sustainable fish harvest from coral reefs. So some fish harvest methods on coral reefs have relatively minimal impacts on reef structure. So if you're spearing or catching fish by hook and line, you could potentially be having harmful impacts on the fish themselves, but you're probably not going to be directly hurting the reef. But there are some types of fishing on coral reefs that directly affect the reef, um, like bottom gill nets that tangle around the coral or get lost in the environment and end up still killing fish for a long period of time, so bottom gill nets are bad. And then there's this type of fishing called muro ami fishing, the traditional type of fishing that they did in Indonesia, where a bunch of snorkelers, that's what these people are here, um, a whole bunch of snorkelers go with rocks on the end of lines and they drop them on the bottom to scare the fish into a net, but all this banging of stuff up and down on the bottom on these sticks busts up the reef in some of the same ways that blast fishing does as they're herding the fish into the waiting net. These communities of folks that do this kind of muro ami fishing, they'll actually spend months or most of their entire lives at sea living on these crowded boats and just kind of making a living from fishing and rarely coming to shore. Here you see them doing that muro ami fishing where they're dropping the rocks on the bottom. But as the reefs are dying out and the fish populations are being depleted, more and more of these people are sort of being forced to move back onto a dry land lifestyle because they just can't sustain this unsustainable type of fishing. Alright, so let's talk about the future of fishing and hopefully the sustainable future. So if we want to continue fishing without messing up the environment, we need to consider the whole ecosystem, and we call that multi-species management. So we're not just considering the direct effects of fishing on the one species that we're harvesting, but we're considering the indirect effects of fishing on the environment. So how is the fishing gear affecting the habitat? What are the effects, ripple effects through the food chain as we're taking the fish out? And we're trying to, come up with better models that will account for all those effects. Another thing we're trying to do is use the precautionary principle, and I'll say something about that later. So ecosystem-based fisheries management is really hard because developing the models that predict not only what's happening to the one species that you're harvesting, but also all those complicated ripple effects is tricky. But some examples of how it's been applied to sort of avoid causing avoidable harms are where we're catching bait fish that are food for seabirds. We've learned that we can catch the same amount of bait fish but not catch them near the seabird colonies, and that way the seabirds don't have to go farther from their colonies to catch fish. They can still catch fish near their bird colonies, and we can catch our fish somewhere else, and then we can sort of coexist with the seabirds. So that's one relatively simple type of ecosystem-based fisheries management. Another thing that we're trying to do is sort of gradually implement ecosystem-based fisheries management. Like we might have a basic fisheries model that focuses on one species, and then we add, bit by bit, add more complexity to it to simulate the environment better. We also need to account for the complexities of translating those ecosystem-based models into policy, which is particularly challenging. So it's not going to happen all at once, and we say it's an evolutionary, not revolutionary approach, because it's sort of a slow bit-by-bit process.